All right, here we go, A-Push, you ready? Roots of the Great Depression, causes and effects. Let me just move these. Some of these pictures are always on the bottom. I don't know why, but that's okay. We're going to go with it. Okay, so we've been talking a lot in class about how the stock market crash was not the only thing that caused the Depression, right? It's the spark, it's the catalyst, but this is a long time coming, and there's several things that lead up to it. We had that long bull market in the 1920s. Business, we know, was really doing well, right? And we know there were high protective tariffs. We know that there was a lot of supply side economics under the policies of Andrew Mellon over 3 different administrations. We know that people were buying things on margin, meaning you only had to put 10% down and you could buy things on the installment plan, including stocks. If prices fell, there was a margin call and everybody would have to quickly pay up, and that worked for a while, but by the time we get to late 1929, the market is not able to really bounce back from that. So there's a small crash on October 21st, and then the big crash comes on Black Tuesday. So Black Tuesday is the day, October 29th, 1929, when you can see stocks lost $10 to $15 billion in value on that one day. So this was pretty serious. This was pretty dramatic. There were stockbrokers that were literally throwing themselves out of buildings on Wall Street because they knew that they not only lost their money, but they lost all the money, all the life savings of all of their investors, and they just couldn't deal with making those calls. So this is why it got the name Black Tuesday, and it's definitely the spark that set off the Depression. Bank runs, now this is when a bank is basically, this is before we had something called the FDIC, okay? So people heard that the market crashed and people started rushing to their banks. And it would be like if you go to your Fifth Third down the street or your Chase Bank or whatever, and you take out in cash all your life savings, which will work for a while, but eventually the bank's going to run out of money if we all do that, right? If the whole population of Rocky River rushes to the bank and takes out money, they're going to run out of cash. Well, now we've got something called the FDIC that insures our banks. Back then, no deposits were insured. And so when the bank was out of money, guess what? You have no money. You just lost everything too. So now whatever you thought was in your account, oh no, it's really not. You've just lost everything. This is why I think even to this day, a lot of people kind of grew up during this and remember this, are a little hesitant to trust banks. Maybe you have a grandparent or somebody who's a little hesitant to put their money in the bank and would rather put it under the mattress or something. You can kind of see why, because 3,000 banks closed in the first year of the Depression alone. And if you didn't get there before your bank closed, you lost everything. Everything. I mean, think about that. How that would shatter your trust, not only your bank account. So what are some of the mistakes that we see made in the 1920s that lead us here? Well, we've been talking, again, in chapter 25, it gets into a little bit this. There's a lot of overproduction in the 20s. There's definitely a big gap between the rich and the poor. A lot of people are buying things on the installment plan. We did see that what Hoover's going to try is one of the highest tariffs in U.S. history, which is the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And it really just backfired. It made other countries even less likely to buy our goods. So it actually really hurt. The Federal Reserve thought that by keeping rates low, it would encourage people to buy, because in a normal situation that would work. But this got so out of control so quickly that instead of encouraging people to buy, it still just made the market kind of tumble, and business owners were still slashing wages. And so it actually didn't really do anything to slow down the situation. By 1933, more than 9,000 banks had failed. And again, we're talking about a crisis of confidence in our economic system. That's what the Depression really does. By 1932, 30,000 companies are out of business. 9 million savings accounts are gone. 12 million Americans, that's 1 in 4, are unemployed. So these are numbers we've never seen before or since, thank goodness. Our Great Recession we're in right now is the worst that it's been since then, but we definitely have some safety nets in place to avoid this kind of a situation ever again. So the reality in the Great Depression was this is just what it was. It was soup kitchens, it was bread lines, it was making do with what you had. You could see the long lines of people here, mostly wearing nice hats. I mean, you can tell trench coats. These people are dressed well. That's the thing. The Depression didn't just hit working class or poor people. It hit everyone. Everybody was affected. Now, if you couldn't pay for your house because you have no wages, you're unemployed, well, eventually the bank's going to foreclose your house. They're going to take your house. And so this is when we start to see people moving to so-called Hoovervilles. named after Herbert Hoover. That's not a nice term, by the way. They're doing that in a derogatory way. Hoover blankets were newspapers. Hooverville is your box that you have to live in. There was actually Hooverville downtown, the municipal lot, where people today, tailgate for Browns games. That's where Cleveland's major Hooverville was. So these are just some of the images you'd see. And there was kind of a sense of community in some sense that people did try to pull together and make do with the best that they had, because it was really bad. So, so these are just some of the situations. It's hard to believe this is the United States of America we're looking at. This looks like something out of more of a third world country, but this is what it was like. So it was really, really bad. But people did the best they could with what they had, and that's what you're seeing here. Okay, hobos were really just a term that was given to mostly young guys, maybe from like about your age, 15, 16, up until their early 20s, and they would just kind of ride the rails, ride the trains around and look for jobs from place to place. And but as you can see, not every city was willing or able to really help the hobos or anybody, as everybody was just down on their luck. And this is where the song Brother Can You Spare a Dime became really popular. If you are a musical person, if you've ever seen the musical Annie, there's a song in there dedicated to Herbert Hoover, and it's during this era. So it's just something that is pretty well portrayed in movies. Even the movie Cinderella Man, which came out just a couple years ago with Russell Crowe, it does a really nice job showing just the hopelessness that people felt. To add insult to injury for the farmers, because we know the farmers have been struggling throughout the 20s where everybody else was doing pretty well, but we see a massive drought in 1932. And this drought really turned the soil into complete just dust. And as you can see from these pictures, we had major dust storms, and they would make it so it was pitch black. You couldn't see. They would cover everything in your house. And a lot of that made people on the plains just pack up and head west. They headed to California, and they were nicknamed the Okies. So I'm sure you guys will read The Grapes of Wrath someday. And The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck was actually something that he wrote when he followed a family of Okies from Oklahoma to California, and wrote about kind of what it was like for them and put it in that story. So you can see here, Route 66 is kind of one of the main, at that point it was the main highway connecting east to west from the St. Louis all the way out to California. And so that was the main route that a lot would do here. So this is kind of hard to see, but right here is a house. And this is the dust storm about to hit the house. So this is what we're talking about. So it's taking a bad situation and making it even worse. So how did people cope? Couple different ways that they coped. And this is, again, we talked about how Hollywood had started to grow in the 20s. Our first Oscar awards were, I believe, 1928, maybe 29. But we see humor and escapism in our movies. So we've got, for the humor, we've got Groucho Marx over here. We also had kind of the glamour and people like Greta Garbo right here. And then this is Shirley Temple. Isn't she cute? And she would do song and dance kind of little movies, and they were just feel good. People went to the movies to escape and kind of forget all the horrible things that were going on in their lives or going on with their family. And then Walt Disney, of course, you guys are familiar with Disney, and you grew up on that too. And Disney is kind of timeless, and Mickey Mouse is going to be, another form of escapism. Donald Duck, Goofy, all those guys, they made people laugh, and that's really what people wanted during the Depression. They just wanted to laugh again. There wasn't a whole lot positive here. We've got other just comedians, George Burns right here and Gracie Allen. They were actually married, and Westerns were starting to be kind of popular. There's The Lone Ranger and Jack Benny, and also soap operas, which really started on radio. They're going to continue during this time, and some of them are still around today. A lot of them are starting to get canceled as popularity's gone down, but I mean, hey, they've been on, in some cases for almost 90 years on the radio. So we definitely see this in writing too. I mentioned The Grapes of Wrath, and that's something that John Steinbeck, an American writer, is really known for, and you guys will read some of him probably next year in American Lit. So let's take a look at what Herbert Hoover does, and I guess more what he doesn't do. So Hoover is full of a lot of promises and quotes. Here's one from March 1930, about 6 months after the crash, where he says, "The worst effects of the crash will have passed in the next 60 days. And that just wasn't true. So I always feel bad for Herbert Hoover. I mean, this is a guy who, again, his resume was flawless. He really, he had plenty of experience. He wasn't a dumb guy, but people just reviled him in a way that I don't think we've seen a president hated, because he was the one when it all came crashing down. So he does take some action. He tries to convince business leaders to stop slashing wages, but he doesn't really provide any means for that. He just encourages them to. Well, eventually most business leaders got to the point where they couldn't. He tried also to increase public works, things like bridges. The Hoover Dam, for instance, is going to be in his name, but didn't really provide extra funds for that, and so it just wasn't going to work. So the other thing he's going to do is create the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to make loans to the banks, the railroads, and agriculture. And he did provide money for this, and it was $238 million, but it still wasn't enough. I mean, in a regular crisis, that would have been plenty, but Hoover is dealing with a situation that had never happened before. That was something that thankfully we haven't seen again. Hopefully we never will. And he was using kind of more old tactics to deal with this. So we thought, we'll put a predictive tariff up. That'll make our businesses better, right? No, it didn't, And the thing about Hoover is he was a classic kind of just fiscal conservative, and he did not want to use the federal government for handouts and relief. He really resisted that. He said that would corrupt the character of the country, and that was something he didn't want to see. So he did do a little in 1932, but still, it's just not that much, The one thing that's really, really, really going to put a stain on his reputation is the bonus army here. So World War I veterans were supposed to get an $1,000 bonus in, ironically enough, 1945, which we now know is the year that World War II ends. Of course, they didn't know that in 1919. Well, they wanted this bonus early. They wanted it now, and so what they did was 15,000 of them are going to camp out in Hoovervilles on DC, on the National Mall, to pressure the government to give them those bonuses. And so this looks bad all around. It makes Hoover look bad. Hoover wanted to help them. It's not like he's anti-veteran, but he just said, look, this just isn't possible right now. I can't give you all your bonuses. There's no way. There's no money for this. So in late July, he did order them to leave. And what ends up happening is they won't. 2 veterans were killed. General Douglas MacArthur, who you might know that name from World War II pretty soon here, gave them an hour to basically, he said, you need to evacuate, because things were getting pretty violent. And when they didn't, some did, but when some of them didn't, this is when the Army had to go in with bayonets fixed on these veterans, these World War I veterans who have survived the trenches, and now they're being literally run out of the mall. And this just looks really bad for Hoover. He, in order to keep order, they have to use tear gas. So they're tear gassing our veterans, and the gas actually killed an 11-month-old boy. So from this point on, Herbert Hoover's reputation is pretty much done. I mean, he is toast. Nobody wants to listen to him. Nobody takes him seriously. They think he's really just done nothing. So it makes it pretty easy in 1932 for a Democrat to win, even though we haven't seen a Democrat in office now for quite some time, since Woodrow Wilson. So FDR does win, and in his first inaugural address, he's going to try to really shift that tone and say the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So trying to reassure Americans that better times are ahead. And here's his wife, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. We'll see she'll really push for civil rights and put pressure on her husband to make changes for civil rights. So what does FDR do? The first 100 days, he passes 15 major pieces of legislation. Now, he does have Democrat majorities in both the House and Senate, so he's able to pull that off. But he also surrounds himself with what he called his brain trust. And his brain trust is, just basically the top economic scholars in the field and political scholars, and he jokingly said they were definitely smarter than him, and he surrounded himself with people like that to get good ideas. He also had what were called fireside chats, and so where Hoover appeared standoffish to the American public, FDR is going to really be able to tap into speak to them in plain language and explain what he did, and focus his efforts on what he called his 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And it's definitely going to be the federal government really stepping in quite a bit here and taking some serious actions. So we're going to pause here, and then I'm going to give you a little bit more and just give you a little background on some of the alphabet agencies in our next slide. And you can check that out, and then in the next video I will also explain your assignment.